I'm going to do is to position risk quantification, and specifically the FAIR methodology, as a complementary approach to risk qualification. So if I look at the agenda, I think the first thing I want to do is just talk about the risk communication challenge. And then what I'm going to do is talk about risk quantification as a complementary solution to address management, and specifically the executive management and the board of directors. And I'm talking about the risk, second line of defense, the risk management entity to express, and wherever they said it could be an IT, it could be an enterprise risk management, to overcome this. So I believe that risk quantification is something that offers an ability to enhance the communication and to also enhance decision-making around risk management. Okay? And then I'm going to end by going through a cyber risk quantification example. Now, the slides and specifically the talk is going to talk about cyber risk quantification, but this approach can be used for any type of risk quantification that you want to do. So that can be even at the operational level, like systems, process, people, etc., or even enterprise or safety risks for that matter. And then, of course, we're going to end with the Q&A. So if I then talk about, the first thing I want to talk about is just the risk communication challenge. I think that what we face in practice is that there is miscommunication and a lack of understanding from various role players in the organization by understanding what these risk officers and the risk practitioners and the managers want to say about risk, right? So if I just look at the role of the Chief Information Security Officer or the Chief Risk Officers, then to a large extent they're talking Greek. And apologies, to me they would be talking Arabic because I don't understand it, unfortunately, because to me it's difficult. Okay. So what do these management want really? So if we look at the head of the organization and the board of directors, what they want to know is they want to know, firstly, they want to be assured that they will not be the next organization or entity that would be in the news about some sort of a disaster or an incident affecting their clients. And then they also want to know, are we doing enough to mitigate risk to an acceptable level? Okay, we talk about risk appetite and risk tolerance. So they want to know, and that comes from a governance point of view, are we mitigating risk or managing risk to an acceptable level? So the question is, what is acceptable? But I think the problem that we have with our traditional approaches is that we get to numbers. In other words, we use a 5-point scale, so 4 times 5 is 20. 20 out of 25, what does it tell me? It just tells me it's unacceptable, but I'll get to that now, right? The other role player, of course, is the Chief Financial Officer. What he wants to know, or she wants to know, is how much risk do we have? And they think in terms of finance, can they quantify it? Then also, are we spending too little or too much on mitigation? So the controls that we are putting in place is costing us money. Right? What is the reduction that I'm getting in terms of, let's call it return on investment of my additional controls? If I look at the CIO, what they want to know is, are we spending our cybersecurity budget, for example, on the right things? So they really want to know is, what are my threats? What are the level of my risks, my technical risks? Because these technical risks, as we'll see a little bit later, have an impact, and it's a business impact, right? And then, of course, there's the audit. So the other challenge that we face in practice is we do risk assessments, and we agree that risk must be reduced. The next step then is, who must do what? What are the actions? Is there a risk treatment plan, and have they been implemented? So from a third line of defense, if you look at that model, the audit is responsible to make sure that the controls are effective, meaning that they have been implemented, they are effective, and we can then conclude that the risk has been reduced to an acceptable level. Okay. So how do we overcome this challenge that exists, right? So let's go and see what the board want. And I'm now also talking about the executive and the senior management. We see that one of the things that they want to do is they want to quantify risk in financial terms. They just don't want to get to a number saying my risk is a 20 out of 25 or an 8 out of 25. They want to say what is the impact in financial terms if that risk realizes. The other thing is they want a more visual representation in order for them to make more informed decisions about the levels of risk. And the risk register, as we know it, the traditional risk register, and the heat map is fine, but it doesn't give you really what they want to the full extent. You can differentiate between the various risks, but what if I have 4 risks that are at the 20? Which of these are the higher risk and what is the impact? The other one is an important one because you want to justify or be able to make a decision in terms of, I need to spend X amount of money to reduce the risk, right? What is the reduction going to be? So there's a need to assess the efficacy of the cyber risk programs, for example, or your risk treatment plans, and the investments I need to make in these additional controls. The other one is prioritization. Don't come to them with technical risks because they want to know is what are my top 10 risks, right? What are the risks related to the top 10 threats, for example? And the last one is, you were talking about cyber insurance, is can we get and quantify risk in order for me to understand for the various types of incidents that I might have from a cybersecurity point of view or any other risk event so that I can take out insurance. So how much insurance must I take out for a risk that is 20 out of 25? I don't know. But if I get to a monetary value and I say the risk is 100 million or 20 million or 5 million, I can then go out and ask the CFO or whoever to take out insurance for 20 million or at least get a premium for that amount. Okay. So what do they get? They get traditional risk registers. And if you look at that, in this example of this risk register, I have, how many do I have there? 2, 4, 5 risks. And they're all at the same level. Now, surely there's a difference between those. We've qualified them. Put yourself in the shoes of the executive or the board or the risk committee. Which ones of these now, we already have now prioritized. These are our top risks, right? But they're all at the same level, say at a level 4, which is, say, a 20 out of 25. You can see that I can't really differentiate. So risk number 1 might have a financial exposure of 20 million. Risk number 2 might have an exposure of 50 million. And the last risk might have an exposure of 100 million. Might be the case. Okay, so how do we close this gap? And I'm now saying risk quantification is an option that is complementary to your traditional risk qualification approach. So typically, we see that IT risk management and risk practitioners, they measure risk in terms of vulnerabilities. They look at incidents, events, control deficiencies. That's all fine. Okay? It's very much compliant with ISO 31000, COSA ERM, etc., right? What the business require is they need visibility in terms of the financial impact of those risks. They also want to know which of these risks must we treat and not treat. So even though we have 5 risks at a level 20, there must surely be a different impact there, and which of those have priority in terms of treatment. And then the last one is they may want to know what the effect or the financial impact could be in order to take out the insurance. So I'm saying risk quantification, or to get to the value of risk, to calculate the value of risk, is that. So what I'm introducing now is to say there is an international standard now managed by the open group that is called FAIR. And what it allows us to do is to use known, tested quantification techniques and statistical models including Monte Carlo and beta PERT, to model risk, and we don't need an actuary to do it. You and me can do that. So all we need is a methodology, which we now have, a program or an application that can handle that, and now we need good input, quality input from subject matter experts, understanding the controls, the effectiveness of the controls, the probability, and very importantly, somebody from the business understanding the impact of that specific risk. Okay? So there is a solution or an alternative. So it's not one or the other. I'm not saying doing away with quality. Everybody is doing that around the world, right? So I'm saying the solution is adopting a standard that allows you to quantify risk. So what does FAIR stand for? It stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. But it's not only for information risk, you can use it for any risk. It could be operational risk or so as well. So what does it offer us? Firstly, there's a standard taxonomy of information and operational risk. So whereas traditional risk management in terms of qualification is looking at risk at one level, it says, look at impact and probability. I multiply the two, and that gives me my risk, which is a number typically. If I use a 3-point scale or a 5-point scale is a number. So typically people use a 5-point scale, so the probability is 3 out of 5, so it's a medium probability, right? The impact is high, so that's a 4. So 3 times 4 is a 12, and that gives me a level of the risk. And now I can compare it with another risk from a qualitative point of view, right? It is also a methodology for quantifying and managing risk in financial terms, and as I said, it's based on statistical methods behind it, and these are tested. So, but I have it now in a practical program or methodology. If I have a software tool to be able to do it, it's important for us now to understand the model, bring the assumptions and the expertise to that, and we can actually model the risk and produce a result in financial terms. It's complementary to ISO 31000, to COSO, ERM, etc., right? And it's an international standard. So there is the model. So you can see what I'm saying is that typically risk there is, in normal circumstances, having two, as only one level below that. It's saying risk consists of impact and probability, and some people add 1 or 2 things to that, but it's essentially what most people do is to say it's impact times probability. What FAIR does, it says there are 2 legs here. So if I look at the probability leg, they talk about loss event frequency. In other words, we want to determine how often in the next year, for example, can we expect this risk to materialize. Now it's giving us a framework where we can make decisions around that. So if I have enough information about the potential loss event frequency or the incidence, I can make an estimate. I can simulate it 10,000 times, and then I can also estimate the minimum likely and the maximum that I can get. Put that number into a statistical model, and it will give me a result, right? If I don't have enough information at that level, what it does then says loss event frequency consists of 2 aspects. The first one, threat event frequency. So in other words, I might have 10,000 or might have experienced 10,000 attempts for ransomware attempts or attacks on our organization, but none of them materialize. So that tells me I'm not vulnerable, but I can also go into vulnerability, because vulnerability is determined by the capability of the threat actor or the resistance strength. In other words, the strength of our controls. Okay. So it gives us a model where we can get to. So even without necessarily using that, the advantage of this is also helping us to start understanding really how to calculate probability, even if we do it from a qualitative point of view. Because we're considering now the threat actors, how capable they are, and on the other hand, we look at our controls and how strong these controls and effective they are, right? So that's the one leg. The next leg says how much. Not now a number in terms of high, very high. We need to now understand the impact of that risk event, if it happens, what it will. And there's two aspects to that, as you see at one lower below the loss magnitude. So the loss magnitude is a monetary. So it's either reals or dollars, whatever currency you're using. Okay. So loss magnitude consists of impacts at two levels. The first one is a primary impact. In other words, if there is a risk event, there's typically a primary loss in terms of financial terms. It could be things like loss of productivity. In other words, our systems are down, and now we can't earn money, so we're going to make a loss or lose business because of that, right? Or it could be recovery costs. I need to get somebody in to come and help me with this malware that is there. It's going to cost me. So I bring in the experts to actually address the technical issues and the malware that has actually spread or the encryption of my systems. And then I also might have recovery costs. If I look at the secondary loss, it could be things like loss of reputation. It could also be things like penalties. You will incur penalty because of whatever has happened. Or it could be competitive advantage. Okay. So as I said, it's a model that is accredited and it's complementary. So within the limits of time, I'd like to maybe go through that. But what does it help us with? So there are various outputs or reasons why we could use this. So for example, it helps us to do risk assessments by looking at the migration to another system to the cloud. What would the increase or the reduction be in monetary terms, right? In terms of my risk. For example, if I do patching, what would it do to reduce my risk? Okay. The other one is, for example, it can be used for cost-benefit analysis. I have a risk of 100 million. I spend 10 million on controls, and that reduces my risk to 50. Okay, so by spending 10 million, I'm reducing my risk by 50. So that should become a no-brainer, isn't it? Because the net effect of that is I'm going to reduce the risk essentially after the investment in those controls by 40. Okay. The other one is comparative analysis. In other words, we can now go to those stakeholders and decision makers and tell them these are our top risks and these are the numbers in financial terms. So if this happens, so if this system is down for various reasons, say cybersecurity, if it's down for 1 hour, then the financial value at risk is X. If it's down for 24 hours or 8 hours, so I can go and now they can compare that and they can actually see that in financial terms, right? And then, so that in general helps me to do that. Okay, so what we're saying here is we now have an approach that is complementary to what is being done already in organizations. So and it's going to overcome this challenge. Most risk management frameworks do not prescribe a specific approach to identifying or analyzing and prioritizing the important things, or the important aspect here, risk, and leave it to the risk practitioners to select the preferred analytics model. In other words, we want to make decisions around risk at the right level, right? So in other words, it could be at a committee level, and eventually it's the executive management that needs to sign, and if they can't, they take it to the subcommittee for risk at the board level, and the board to agree to the risk. So we want to make decisions around risk, so we want to make informed decisions around risk, right? So this is where FAIR comes in. It helps us to identify the top risks. It also helps us to quantify it in monetary terms. And now, visually, we can see what the effect is of the controls, how it's being reduced. And now we overcome this language barrier that we have. Now we have the ability to talk to the executives in financial terms, something that they understand. as opposed to technical controls and risk registers that is not very clear in terms of what they really want to see, right? So if I look at this, what are the building blocks there? I think the first thing we need to say is that we have business assets that typically are supported by IT assets, for example, or people, right? So what is a business asset? It could be a business service, a business process, or it could be data or IP or any of those. Then it forces us or helps us to understand who the attack or what the attack vectors are and the threat agents are and how capable they are, okay? So those business assets are threatened by actors. It could even be accidental internal. Mostly it's external. And if you look at cybersecurity, there are malicious threat actors out there that are very experienced that is attacking your company or that are attacking your company, and this is real. What these threat actors then do is they compromise your controls. So in other words, if you don't have effective controls in place, they overcome those controls or the vulnerabilities or weaknesses in those controls, and they affect the asset. That meaning, my IT system is down, the process doesn't work, and I can't offer the service to my clients out there. Meaning, it's going to be having a direct or indirect impact. And I can think of it now in terms of financial terms. So there's going to be either a direct impact, a loss of productivity, or it could be a fine, because whatever we've done there may be disclosing personal information, and that fine might have a monetary value. So those are the building blocks. So what I'd like to do and end up with an example. Okay, so the scenario that I have is a cybersecurity one, and as I said, is not only applicable to cybersecurity events, you can use it for operational enterprise risk, etc. And you can quantify risk using this methodology. So the scenario that I have is there is a cyber criminal community, the threats, the threat actors, coming from a threat vector. They might be capable, very professional, or they might not be, okay? The more capable they are, of course, the more probability there is for them to bypass my controls. If I have weak controls, then that means it's easy for them to get through, right? Then I have the assets. In this instance, there's a technical asset, which is a server. This is the most important thing is that server is running a business application, which is one of our core applications, and it is helping us to deliver this service to the clients. So if this technical asset, which is the server, is affected, corrupted, encrypted, then the service will not be down, meaning that our systems will be unavailable to our clients out there. And that will have an effect. And may have, most probably it will, have a monetary value to attach to that, which we don't normally do at the moment. We don't calculate that. We don't go that far. We don't have a framework or methodology to be able to do that, right? And in a lot of instances, we need to start thinking and teaching ourselves, for example, the subject matter experts in IT, to start thinking in terms of efficacy of controls, strength of controls, as opposed to just saying, I have a control, right? And we need to bring the business in, because they're the people that can bring their expertise to bear so that we can make an estimate about the impact. Okay. So now we have some questions. The question is, how much would it cost if this ransomware event materializes, right? Of course, timing is important. Is it an hour, 8 hours, 24 hours? And eventually I'd like to stand, what is the probability in the next year that it may happen? So that's the risk event. The incident as such. If I spend money now in terms of controls that reduces or increases my controls that protect me from cyber or ransomware events, right? How much would the exposure be reduced by? And then lastly, for example, how can I justify this budget request for ransomware-related controls in a way that the executives that need to approve the budget or this cost can understand it. Okay, so typically what we then do is, the first part is I establish the context and gather the data. So let's take the scenario and say it's a ransomware attack. I want to see what the impact is. The context could also be, look at the risk related to, for example, cybersecurity of my top 10 systems. And I want to see what the probability is and what the impact is, right? Then I analyze the risk, but I have a more thorough approach to risk analysis now. And then I put it into a model. So we provide a Python-based program which has taken this statistical this model and enables analysis using statistical methods like Monte Carlo and beta PERT. Okay, and then you run the model, and now we're in a position to analyze the risks. So in other words, we can now compare the risks, more than one risk, for example, with the other one, and look at the financial impact. Or I can go further by saying, if I spend X amount in terms of enhancing my controls, what would the reduction be to my overall value? And then I can report results. Now I can go to the executive. It could be a risk committee, it could be the IT management, it could be the CEO, his management, or whatever related risk committee there is, and I can even take it to the board, right? So in this instance, typical things that I would look at is I look at this risk description. So the example here is a ransomware attack holds infected systems or files hostage until you pay the victim. Okay. So what are the assets? The technical assets are the IT or the major IT applications or systems. Those are the ones that get encrypted typically if there's a ransomware attack. Then I need to understand who the threat actors are. Now we understand then these are highly experienced cybersecurity criminals, right? So even if I have strong controls, they might overcome that because they are capable. They do that as a business, and typically they sit in the dark web somewhere, right? Then what is the threat effect? It is the impact on the business, which is the non-availability of the systems, which means the services to our end clients. And who is the risk owner? It should be the CEO and the business unit managers, right? Who are the control owners? It's IT. Okay, so that sort of analysis you can go into more detail, but you can see I need to understand the scenario. And now, for example, I can do that and say, if I look at the threat event frequency, then we can see our existing malware protection system blocked 1 to 2 ransomware attacks in the past year. So we had 2 attempts in the last year. I know of companies that had 40,000 attempts by actors wanting to take their systems and them ransom by encrypting their systems, okay? So it's very prevalent, okay? In this instance, it's 1 to 2. So that gives me an indication and an input that I can look in terms of probability for the next year, right? So if the ransomware cannot be blocked, there is nothing we can do, and we are 100% vulnerable. Okay, so we're assuming in this instance, maybe we don't have any proper controls in place. Okay. The next thing we want to do, which I don't have on the slide, is to bring the business in, say, if we have a ransomware attack, and we understand which services and applications are being affected, they can tell us if these systems are down for 1, or this critical core system is down for 1 hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, 7 days, these are the values. Because we are losing revenue, maybe we need to recover, and there might be penalties. Okay. What I then do is I put that in the model, and you can see now, using input of this information, putting it into the statistical model, I simulated, for example, 10,000 times, which is a known statistical approach, and I'm using beta PERT. In other words, I want the subject matter experts, both on the control and on the impact side, to tell me what is most likely, what a maximum, and what are the minimum. So I'm getting a range, and that helps me then to provide a range as opposed to one discrete number, which is a 25, to the business management, which is a known statistical approach, right? So in this instance, that example that I had, ransomware, we say that if this risk materializes, the financial impact would be 49 million. Now, what I haven't talked about is the others, but you can see in this instance, we've also then done one for violating regulations around privacy, for example, and the third one is a denial of service attack. So the one risk is a 49 million, the other one 21 million, and the third risk, denial of service attack, is 10 million, and my total risk exposure for cybersecurity in these top 3 cybersecurity risks stand at 81 million. Now, in a large organization, international organization, it may not be a lot of money, so it's all contextual in terms of, is it affordable, what is my appetite, and what are my tolerance levels, right? Now, what I want to do next is now get into a what if, right? Must we reduce the risk? And what must we do? In other words, if we take into consideration controls, what would the reduction be or the effect on the value at risk? Okay. So there's my what if. In other words, I've now considered controls, and this risk has come down from 49 million to 18 million. So what is it, 52? So it's come down by more than 30 million. Is that right? No. 20 over 50, it's 30 million, right? So if I spend 5 million to reduce the risk from 49 to 18 million, will you approve that? The next risk came down from 21 million to 19 million. If I have to spend 3 million now, should I do that? No, because the risk reduction is not. So you can see this is just an example of showing how we can do it. The last one then says, if we spend some money, we can't do anything, the risk stays the same. Okay. So management then says, go ahead with the first one, right? Spend 10 million rand, and that brings down my risk from a monetary point of view, right? So you can see in terms of the graphic now, what it does give us, as opposed to a discrete number of 20, it tells me that risk has basically a minimum, a maximum, and a most likely, which the most likely is, where are we? Yeah, that's the total risk, in other words. But it gives me, and then it tells me, if I put the controls in place, this risk is going to reduce from there to there. So what have I done? I have a model which is fair. I've made some assumptions by subject matter experts. I've put that in the model. I've simulated 10,000 times. I also looked at minimum, maximum, and then I can go further if I need to, and we're not happy with that result, to calibrate. So go back and get us more information, because the numbers don't gel necessarily, right? So to end by saying, look at this now. In other words, when we did the analysis initially, those were the levels of the risk. So management can immediately see, in terms of monetary, there's a differentiation. The one is 48, the other one 21, and the other one 10, okay? And if I now add controls, there's going to be a reduction from there to there. So there's my inherent risk. There's not a lot happening there, and that risk remains the same. And the decision is now clear. Go and spend 10 million, up to 10 million to reduce that risk, meaning we're going to have a saving of 30 million. Okay, so in a nutshell, it is not replacing qualitative, and you're not going to do it for every assessment, but you can see clearly it adds value by looking at my top risks and specifically helping to enhance the communication and the quality of information and the decision making at the right levels. Thank you. Any questions?
counted like data. Data is not the revenue, which is the main nerve of this company. So how is it a system that will retrieve this data? There's some data is more important than the money, that revenue of the company, for example. Oil and gas especially, and there's a reserve data, a lot of data. I have even in the cloud, some time they could not retrieve it, or the insurance of this data become more than the real value of the data. So this is another game. Some people, they get insurance for things like 5 million, and they ask for, as you said, 80 million, and they get. So who's going to evaluate the data? Because data for a certain organization is not the same value of another organization. Is that, if you have an answer for this?
Okay, to calculate the value of the data is not that, but let's go back to the effect. In other words, if that data is compromised, right, is there a direct loss in financial terms? Is there a productivity loss? In other words, is that data needed in order to deliver a service or a process? So if the process depends on that data, means that there's an indirect, the data might not be valuable, but it is valuable in terms of needed by a process to deliver a service, right? That's the one, right? So the question is there productivity loss? Okay. If not, say there is nothing, right? So I'm not going to look at attaching a value to the data. I wanted to attach a value to the effect of that data not being available, okay? So let's say it's not available. But now I have to recover this data, right? Do I need to get specialists in to come and recover? Say this data has been encrypted, for example, right? Do I need to get specialists in, and there's going to be a cost associated with these specialists? So that's one way of looking at the effect. In other words, I'm going to have to pay specialists now to come in and to come and recover, to recover this information. In other words, to make it available again. And is there then a replacement cost? So most probably there isn't, because it didn't affect the system it's sitting on. So in this instance, there might be a recovery cost, right? It might not be that high, right? The next thing is we need to move on to the next thing and say, is there an indirect loss? That data being compromised, is it going to affect our reputation? If it is going to affect our reputation, that's more of a difficult one, then we need to do it. Okay, so let's put that in a model and then see what the reputational cost related to that is. Okay. The second aspect to that is then to say, is there a penalty to this data? In other words, if this data has been compromised, so somebody has stolen my data and encrypted it, right? So now I have violated, for example, if I look at GDPR, may be applicable to the organization or not, right? So GDPR is about the European Union that says any data, personal data of European citizens may not be compromised, right? And if it is compromised, then organizations that do that will pay a penalty, and it could be quite substantial. So you can see, yes, there is a penalty, and it could be $20 million, right? So that's the way I would get to that, as opposed to wanting to attach a value to that. So I used the model then in terms of looking at the impact, going through that. There's no productivity loss. There's a recovery cost. So how much do we need for these specialists to come in and to read? There's no replacement cost. And then the indirect is, there's reputational loss. We're going to be in the papers. Our clients are going to be unhappy because this data cannot be, say, for example, you're a research organization or you're a bank, and I need information about my account data, etc. Now it's not available. So I have a negative perception about the bank. And the other one is to say you may even pay a penalty because this data was disclosed and you didn't protect it properly. So that's the way the model can help you to actually report on that.
Thank you very much. Sometimes hackers come from the nearest colleague who left the work, and nobody take care of that friend. He used to be a friend. By any means, maybe there was a dispute between the company and that person, and he left. We have so many things of that. How you Of course, they have to, maybe before sending him back or releasing him, there must be measure to protect all this system. We had so many fatal hackers here in Oman. Maybe most of them, they don't know. And how you protect from the nearest person, not from the enemy, of course.
Okay, we need to differentiate between employees that can do certain actions, or disgruntled employees, in other words, they are still working for you, or ones that are leaving the organization. Now, ones that are leaving the organization, you need a well thought out and implemented identity and access management policy and a process by saying that the moment somebody leaves the organization, and that could also then be contractors, so employees, temporary workers, etc. So you need to link your Active Directory in your HR system and your access to the systems, that if somebody leaves the organization, the access is immediately revoked. Okay, so that's the basic one. So in other words, you overcome that. Now you make it difficult for them. Immediately, they might have knowledge, they might have a password, but immediately they don't have access. So they're in the same position as anybody that does not work there, because they don't have an identity or access rights anymore, and maybe they understand what your weaknesses are, right? But that's how you would make it difficult for them to do. The other one is for insiders. In other words, you need to also have a proper identity and access management system, making sure that those that have privileged access, for example, programmers, must have certain rights, and the access to that have certain conditions which is different to that person as an employee and that person as a system administrator. So if you look at your typical cybersecurity controls, if you implement the basics, will actually take care of that, which means then what you're doing is you're mitigating the risk of a disgruntled employee, a current employee, an ex-employee, or even somebody from outside hacking into your systems. You must make it difficult. So the moment people leave the organization, the access rights must be revoked immediately. Okay. Then, of course, there are other things like data loss prevention, etc., or things finding out people are attempting to come in from outside. I need a security incident management system, which actually then look at people attempting to hack into the system so that I can actually escalate that. If you find?
One of your team is a good hacker, and he did he entered to the system and he did something. Okay, you caught him, okay? What are you gonna do with him?
Okay, what does your policy say? A policy then says, from an identity and access management point of view, is
take him to court or you hire him to protect you.
You can do that. Depends on what you want to do there, right? But the first thing is there must be
a gap in your system. Actually, I'm saying this from a real story in one of the bigger organization. One of the students find a gap that he can enter to the center and change everything, but that organization they didn't say even thank you for him. He was very regretting that. So in state, if you have somebody like what's happening in another country, they looking for this smart people who's hacking, and they offer them a job that to protect, because they are the only guys they know, because they work in the gray area and they work in the dark area, which is the dark room, and they know where to go and get in, and very smart. We have to respect them.
Okay, that's one option. So it depends on what your policy is, right? So some people would say, let them go immediately. But you must also have a policy that says there are repercussions. In other words, there are things happening if you don't do that. It's not allowed, and we might even let you go. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, hi. You've mentioned about quantifying risk, that it depends on impact and probability. Is there any third element that could affect the quantifying risk, like interrelation with other risk, or weighting on the control? Like, could you have more than 2 elements? You could have 3 elements on quantifying risk, like based on the level of quantifying the control?
Okay, so from a fair point of view, you can see there's two aspects. How they overcome that is there's more detail at a lower level. So that we go to 4 levels, I think, right? So that means if we don't have enough information at the incident level, we can look at how many events we had, right? And then if we don't, we're going to look at, for example, the contact frequency of hackers and how easy it is and how capable they are, right? That's how I overcome that. I know that people from a qualitative point of view look at impact and probability and they add another factor. So it is 2 times 3 times 2, that's 6 times 12, that gives you that. It complicates it a little bit, but that's how people want to do that. There's most probably nothing wrong with that. But this methodology takes care of it because it actually builds and explains to you what event frequency is consisting of. And, you know, to understand vulnerability and the strength of the control and the capability of the threat actor, that's how it's taking care of that complexity. Okay. What it doesn't do is tie the risk to maybe other risks. You can then go back and look at systemic risks or so, but let's just go overcome the challenge of just quantifying risk or reporting it properly. I think that's the first step that we want to get to.
Yes. Interestingly, to gain insights of the fear. That's one of the lesson learned, or a new terminology. But I was thinking, is there any relationship or correlations between the BIA, because there you do the cost as well for the critical, let's say, applications?
The BIA, as I understand it, does not look at cost. It looks at the impact, the impact on the business, not necessarily on the cost, right? Mm-hmm. So it looks at a qualitative impact. The impact is very high. What is it on? So that's the focus, but it doesn't get to cost. Okay.
It gives you the cost of the time. It does. Like, you know, how much it costs you. Like, let's give an example.
Okay, if you have that information, you can utilize that in terms of getting that. Now, what you mentioned there is important, because if I've done a proper business impact assessment,
yes,
that's going to tell you what my critical systems are, for example, at a technical level.
Exactly.
Are you with me?
Yes.
And that becomes an input here, because I think the first things people struggle, if I look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the first thing it does, it says, do you understand what your attack surface is? They call it something else. Do you understand what your assets are that could be compromised, right? Yes. Services, applications, processes, or whatever the case is. And a lot of people struggle with that because they don't differentiate between the importance. Now, if you've done a proper business impact analysis, that's going to tell us what our most important systems or processes are, services are, right? So let's start with the business services. I can understand that relationship, and that becomes an input into this. Because you can now go to management and say, we've done a proper business impact analysis, right. And out of this is our most important area, this is our most important system, this is most important data. And you can differentiate that. That becomes an input into this. The other thing that you need to do, of course, with business continuity is then start looking at the potential events that could bring down your business, right? Yes. So if it's at the business level, what would cause my people not to be available, right? My accommodation not being available, my network, my electricity, etc. So these two could be utilized as an input to enhance the quality of data that I need at this level. Otherwise, I have to do that from scratch here and saying, let's ignore that, and now we have a difficulty in terms of differentiating. So that's the advantage of having done a proper business impact analysis, and also a proper risk assessment around the uncertainty in relation to the availability of other services, processes, people, systems, technology, whatever there is.
Thank you. Yeah, because we do it, but we don't. I mean, as an BIA, we do it for most of the critical systems, especially for the financial institutions, and as a regulator, we need to ensure the continuity of this. And if there is any disruptions, how much a minute per second an hour it's going to cost us.
Okay, but you see, that's the focus is not necessarily, if you do it in terms of cost, well done, but most companies then do in terms of it
Quality.
cannot be unavailable for more than an hour or minute or 10 days or whatever, right? Very few actually do, and I don't think the business impact analysis was necessarily foreseen to get to cost, but if you've done cost, it's a very good foundation to bring here, because if you put it through this model now, you can actually then say, if this system is down for an hour or a minute or 8, you can actually use that as various scenarios, compare those, and then they can see if it's down for a minute, an hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, 7 days, immediately they can see what the value at risk is, taking into consideration direct and indirect impact, and that's the advantage of the model.
Okay, good. So it's through the RTO and RPO, and that's going to be an input. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I have a small point. As we know, when we are measuring the risk, we look for the probability and impact. But when we are measuring the impact or evaluating the impact, might I evaluate it at 5 or 4? Another person might evaluate it for 1 or 2. So in that time, we will find a dispute between us. How can we gather those two different point of views?
I think the first thing is to develop proper scales. In other words, and that's what people say, they think that's quantification. The first thing is to qualify your scale. In other words, when we look at impact, to your organization, what does a 1 mean? What does a 5 mean, right? So what does a very high impact mean? So there could be 2 aspects, is to say the core systems are down, right? And say it might cause X amount of rand, but that's not quantification. That is a financial value to that. So my message to you is make sure your impact and your probability scales are well written and understood, so that if there are 2 people making an assessment, they would come to the same estimate approximately. Are you with me? It depends still on what people tend to think, but you need to put it into a session, and that's why the best way of doing risk assessment is to get the risk owner and the subject matter experts, people understanding the controls and understanding the business impact together in the same room, and it doesn't always happen that way, unfortunately. And then you do a facilitation and you can have that debate. Because the facilitator, for example, somebody from the risk office, the risk officer, second line of defense, has a policy and have proper written scales, and now they discuss that and then they come to an agreement, as opposed to one person sitting in the corner there, sucking that and say, quickly, I do a risk register. That's unfortunately how a lot of these risk registers at a qualitative level is done, is they leave it to somebody, and one person is looking at both impact and probability and come and report that. Now, that's not going to work, because that person typically is not the one really in the front line in the trenches understanding the controls, and from the business understanding the impact.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a question regarding the same thing, maybe completion to his question. So if we have a risk register for all the organization, we have like a matrix for probability. All the risk in the organization is judging based on this probability matrix and consequence matrix which we have. So if we have cybersecurity, it's a very critical issue. So it is more professional to judging in a special risk matrix because for example, in an organization risk matrix, we have a probability of 1 to 2 years, for example, which is maybe not applicable for cybersecurity because it's very high impact and very sensitive issues. So I don't know from your experience whether it is more proper to have a specific matrix for cybersecurity or not, and whether the historical information is the only way to have the probability, because, for example, in Corona, we're judging the overall situation because there is many attacks because people getting use these digital devices. So we judging based on overall situation, not the historical information. In historical information, we don't have a cyber attack for the internal system, for example.
Okay, I think there's two issues there. I think what you're asking for is, should we have a specific matrix or scale for cybersecurity?
Yeah.
The answer is yes and no. What you should have is, you should have a policy and a framework and a process for enterprise risk management, okay? Because these are categories. What is enterprise risk management? It says it is the uncertainty in relation to my strategic objectives or my operational objectives. So I'm looking at what will prevent me from achieving my objectives. Okay, so that's the context.
Yeah.
The second one, if I look at operational risk, then it says it is the uncertainty in relation to my systems, which include IT systems, which could be cybersecurity attacks, my people, right? My processes, and then external events. And that external events could be this threat actor from the dark web attacking me. Okay, so that becomes the context. If I look at IT, I look at IT risk as the uncertainty in relation to IT's ability to support the business. And that's where IT continuity, misalignment, and all of those things come into it, right? So the best practice is to actually then have a policy, a framework for enterprise risk management, which is the umbrella, right? Yeah. And that could then be scales, right? What I then need to do is to say my operational risk, let's develop a policy for operational risk, because our focus and context becomes now people, process, systems, and external events, right? If I look at cybersecurity, what am I looking at? I'm looking at the uncertainty in relation to the threats to assets or potential of events and incidents of my assets that are linked to the internet. So that's what cybersecurity is about, right? And that's the thing with information security. It says it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So yes, it affects all of those. But the real thing is, in life at the moment, organizations are being attacked via the internet. It's because of the exposure to the internet, their services, etc. So that becomes the focus. So the best way of doing that is to have a specific cybersecurity policy, a cybersecurity framework with its scales, and a process and procedures for cybersecurity risk management. Okay. So by the way, Allianz Insurance is doing an international survey every year. And guess what? What is the biggest risk that they have perceived? What is the top risk over the last 3 years? Cybersecurity. Okay. So it is something that is happening. So I don't know if I've answered you there, but you could use the same scale. Sometimes people differentiate that, but I think it's the same answer there. Is if you have a well-written and understood and applied, so training and awareness and facilitation is an important one, then you apply the scale properly, and your end result and quality would be much better.
May I add to her question very briefly? In the case of not having historical data, and you don't have data to analyze, how do you minimize risk?
Okay, sorry, I forgot that. The advantage, if you apply or implement the proper cybersecurity tools right now, for example, you should have a security incident and event management system, right? That looks at your events, it looks at your incidents, and analyzes and monitors your whole environment, right? So what it's doing, it's collecting real time a lot of information. So those people coming from there's a lot of information about the threats, attempts, etc., etc. So if you have a SIM, as what they would call that, it's going to give you a wealth of information and proper data to tell you about the potential events. And that's why I'm saying I have this one example of a company that says there were 40,000 attempts. Through my SIM, I could actually see there were 40,000 attempts to actually get there. Or we had so many malware, phishing attempts and 3 or 4 of them were successful, right? So that information is there if you just start implementing the basic cybersecurity technology to monitor. So like your network, you must also monitor your cybersecurity, and it goes down to logs, events, so I can actually see what is happening in my whole estate and in my cybersecurity environment. And that information, we want people now to be able to utilize in order to inform this probability.